All right, well, let's pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day. We pray for your blessing on this class. Help us to think, help us to apply these things to our lives, and be glorified in all that happens in this building today. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, we're at the rule of law here in week 10, and this is pretty generic but it is a theme that runs through these sections, roughly 23 through 27, those questions in Rutherford. Let me just give you a brief outline of where we're going today, and I didn't know how to shorten these, and this is more thematic. They'll overlap some of the questions here. But we're going to look at republicanism. We mentioned the forms of government last time, and I explained briefly the difference between a republic and these other ones, but the link between that and decentralized sovereignty or power. Remember, power, authority, the importance of it being decentralized to restraining it. Second, power essential, performance accidental. This is going to have to do with the office. The king versus the tyrant. Same person? Maybe. But how do you tell the difference? So that we're going to get into that. And then third, there's going to be something that I call, this is not Rutherford's phrase, this is mine, to describe what he's going to talk about. State of war consciousness, sometimes I call it state of war recognition. And the seizing of power, and he's going to mean that in a good way. He's going to say there's situations where this has to be done. Why? Okay, so that's where we're going. Little review. This is where we left off. He's dealing with the objection. Wait a minute. Why do people say then that the king is the living law, that he's the embodiment of the law and so forth? He says, but this maketh, he grants the point, but then he says, but this maketh not the king greater than the law, for therefore do rulers put the stamp of relation to punishment on the law, because there is intrinsic worth in the law prior to the act of the will of lawgivers, for which it meriteth to be enacted. And therefore, because it is authorizable as good and just, and the king putteth on it this stamp of a politic law. In other words, there has to be somebody to enact it. That's all that's meant by that. Doesn't mean he creates it, or its lawfulness comes out of him. God formeth being and moral aptitude to the end in all laws, to wit, the safety of the people, and the king's will is neither the measure nor the cause of the goodness of kings. And that's really where we're going today, more so even than the law. I said the rule of law, but the king is not the measure of good laws. He's also not the measure of good kings. That's crucial and seems to be missing as an understatement. A lot of people's understanding of Romans 13, which we can talk about a little bit. But the royalist essential argument is put in the mouth of a guy, an interlocutor named Mr. Simmons or Simons. We've run into him before, who says that authority is rooted rather in the prince than in the law. For as the king giveth being to the inferior judge, so he doth to the law itself, making it authorizable. I quote that without putting it up there, just to remind you that the royalist is, let's do this. The royalist has this here, even if he pays lip service to this, to some divine or eternal law, he demotes this by putting the king there, certainly above the people. It's a totally different view than the view Rutherford is championing here. But our first point is republicanism, and what that is referring to is a form, or the mode of thought, I suppose, in the form called a republic. And if you remember, that came from these two Latin words meaning thing and public, or for our purposes, objective. It's the thing that is outside of us, over, above us. We all have access to it. That's what's meant by public in this context. So the republic is so named because it is above all the other forms. It holds the line of human law under eternal law. So that's the big objection. Why even talk about it as some rule of laws not of men? Come on, men are going to be ruling no matter what form you talk about. This is the form that's actually not talking about the men. The whole focus is on the law. And if you say to that, oh yeah, the focus is, if we do, exactly, your frustration right now is actually exactly the point. And I mentioned the story of Benjamin Franklin coming out of Independence Hall, and the woman asking him, "Sir, what have you given us?" And he says, "A republic, ma'am, if you can keep it." The argument for a republic is not that it is a panacea, that it is a magical pill that will sustain itself. No, you have to be diligent and sustain it. The point, though, is it is the form where you actually look at the law, where you actually don't look at a mere mortal as your God. But in looking through the law, God remains God, the God of justice. Okay, so it puts the focus on that which is immutable in law as the objective thing. So the object of mind and reason is that essence of justice in the law which is independent of the whims of man, independent of counting noses, or how great these men are above these men, or whatever. And in this vein, Rutherford makes allusion to Romans 3:4 by saying, "If the king be he who maketh the law good and just, because he is more such himself, then as the law cannot crook and err, nor sin, neither can the king sin, nor break a law." And he's basically saying, but this is blasphemy. Every man is a liar. That's why I say Romans 3:4. He's alluding to it without quoting it directly. A law which deserveth the name of a law cannot lie. And obviously that's not true of a mere mortal. So this is one of the places in which Rutherford points to the lesser magistrate and his duty. He's talked about it. He's going to draw it out more toward the end of the book, but he brings it out here, and he uses the example of Jeremiah 26, in which Rutherford says, the officials of all the people said to the priests, this is Jeremiah 26:16 itself, and then I'll get back to Rutherford commenting. The officials of all the people, so the officials, plural, so who's that? Of all the people said to the priests and the prophets, this man, namely Jeremiah, does not deserve the sentence of death. And they even appealed to precedent, how Micah had prophesied to Judah, and yet that king, Hezekiah, did not put him to death in verses 18 and 19. So you had these officials, plural, say to the king, who somebody had convinced him, the priests and the false prophets, this man deserves to die. Why? He's telling us the truth. Kill him. These guys, these officials, who were calling lesser magistrates, said to the king, no, and then they gave their reasons why. The law, prior precedent, etc. Now recall the distinction between fountain power and executive power. If I had my flow chart left to right, fountain power would be back here, and you'll see it in a second on a slide, and executive power over there. These parallel the natural coming first, political second. What absolutely must be there because of the image of God, and then what can be there if it's consistent with it. Rutherford answers the objection that the king is the fountain of the law in this way. He says the people being the fountain of the king must rather be the fountain of laws. So if they're the fountain of the king, they're the fountain of the laws. It is false that no man maketh laws to himself. Those who teach others teach themselves also. 1 Timothy 2:12, 1 Corinthians 14:34. He could have added Romans 2:15. They are a law to themselves. Doesn't mean autonomous or that these individuals create the law any more than the king does. It just means, same thing with the argument against the Pope. Is I have a noggin. That's part of the image of God. That's really what he's saying there. But they agree to the penalty of law secondarily only. In other words, having there be a king. And so doth the king who, as a father, doth not will evil of punishment to his children, but by a consequent will. Stop. In other words, they would never agree to subjecting themselves to other men and police officers and jail, but only for the sake of defense, not as an end in itself. The king is the only supreme in the power ministerial of executing laws, but this is a derived power, so as no one man is above him, but in the fountain power of royalty, the states are above him. That'll be crucial. I hope my picture shows this. Yes, good. So it's not just the individuals in the locale, and then picture the king at the center. Let's just do that, because this is going to be more like the American system here. But of course, there's a British constitution. It's just unwritten in that sense, in the same way. So picture the king there in the center. Would make a difference. Rutherford's saying you don't just have people and the king on these two poles, a locale, people, and then a king at the center. You have a mediating something, which the English just call the estates. Really was a medieval thing. And you'll hear him use that word. Jeremiah 26, which we just read, just said the officials. But we're using this phrase lesser magistrate to show that those officials at the more local level, it's not just this bare individual. So you see on my chart here, the dotted line, whoever's in charge of that, yes, they are in charge of more. They are a more general magistrate. I have a dotted line because though they are more in extension, they're least in nature. In other words, they were not by nature, but by will. They are not an end in themselves, they are a hired cop. Locally, more locally, now I have a bold line. They have less authority in extension, but more in nature. Why? Because then you get down to the individual, the image of God, self-government, most authority in intention. Remember that picture from last week? You can review it later on if you want. Extension, covering more of a thing. Intention, more of the nature of that thing. But directly, what is power by God in nature? So that's the flow chart. So not quite left to right here. Now it's locale to center. Locale to center. Local to general. That's the flow here. So Rutherford says the civil law is clear that the laws of the emperor have force only from this fountain because the people have transferred their power to the king. They're delegating their power. They're not giving it up. So Rutherford acknowledges the same transfer as famously Thomas Hobbes would about 7 years later, but he comes to a very different conclusion. Hobbes came to the conclusion that once you transfer it, it's not yours anymore. As we've seen from Rutherford, you retain your nature, you retain your power, and he calls it a fountain power. Okay? So they cannot transfer that which is only theirs extrinsically. The image of God has no right to transfer that in the sense of giving up, in the sense of committing suicide, just slower. Well, he hasn't killed me yet. I've just given him my life because, no, I'm not saying he's my God, but yeah, you are. You've given him your whole life. You actually don't have that right. The image of God is a stewardship from God, as we've seen. I am not my own intrinsically. I have this power, this fountain power, extrinsically. So I can transfer help as a guardianship. I cannot transfer it in total, as the one I transfer it to is not my God. Only God is my God. Okay, so this is sort of the root of statism. Rutherford's not really getting into a psychology of that, but it's worth noting here. So one implication already hinted is now drawn out. If there is a grievance to be redressed, does the citizen merely supplicating the magistrate prove the superiority of the magistrate? That becomes another argument of the royalist. Well, if he even has the right to lift up his voice and to cry out for justice, isn't that then grace or mercy coming from the king? Rutherford says no. They supplicate, and he uses two phrases here, two Latin phrases to make the point, but he tells you in English what he means. They supplicate ex decentia, of decency and conveniency for his place, as a city supplicate a lord mayor. But they supplicate not ex debtio, of obligation, debt, as beggars seek alms. Then should they be ciphers. When a subject some of the King James stuff is getting me here, oppressed supplicateth his sovereign for justice, the king is obliged by office to give justice. In other words, you're approaching your servant with this cry for justice. He is obligated by law to give you justice. And to hear the oppressed is not an act of grace and mercy as to give alms, though it should proceed from mercy in the prince. And he quotes a psalm there. But an act of royal debt. Okay, now the British form. It looks more like this. And he uses this phrase all the time, that the estates that make up Parliament, and there's three estates, the clergy, nobility, and commoners. Now don't worry about a whole history of England, how it got to be the House of Lords and House of Commons and all that different stuff. But it was a very medieval thing in all those countries to talk about the estates. But again, it's using the word the same way as the officials in that Jeremiah passage. And the idea here, again, the flow chart, by nature, through the states, creates the most general office, so that if that office becomes a tyrant, the office can't become a tyrant. The man in the office can become. So we make a distinction. We get in there with a scalpel, and we distinguish between the man and his performance versus the actual design. Okay, so Parliament was nearer to the people who would be oppressed than is the king, because each represents the people more locally. And so he answers the new objection that at best, all Rutherford shows is a coordinate relationship. So the next royalist objection is, all that shows is a coordinate. They're equal. Fine, they're equal. Where the Parliament or any estates can make their case to the king, but they are still coming to the king essentially as beggars, really. But he replies, two answers. Answer one, the Parliament is coordinate ordinarily with the king in the power of making laws. But the coordination on the king's part is by derivation. On the Parliament's part, and he uses this expression in Latin, as in the fountain. So yes, they are equally office holders, having the same authority. True. But remember, because of their nearness to the people, they represent the people in this fountain power in a way that the more general government does not. It's completely opposite from the way we've thought from the 20th century on, which is why we're losing our freedom. Answer two, in ordinary, there is coordination, but if the king turned tyrant, the estates are to use their fountain power. Wait, I thought the person had fountain power. Yes, but because of their nearness to the person, this is the mechanism, the lesser magistrate, through which he retains that power to himself, takes it back when the king turns tyrant. Same principle, now let's apply this to the American scene again. Same principle is built into the 10th Amendment of the United States Constitution. Now, before we get there in the timeline, understand that in the ratification of the Constitution in 1791, 2 years after the ratification of the whole document, the selling point to the anti-federalists who said this Constitution is going to create an empire and you're going to lose all the freedom that we just gained from Great Britain, et cetera, et cetera. And so the Bill of Rights was put in there to guarantee that it would not do that. How did it do that? It did that by a series of, think of it like the 10 Commandments to the federal government from the people. Congress shall not, Congress shall not, Congress shall not. Thou shalt not. Congress, the central government, is my servant. I am their master. Congress shall not. What is the Constitution? It is the commandments of the people to the servant. You shall not. We are giving you these things in order to protect our image of God that we have from God. You will only do these things. So the 10th Amendment is sort of an exclamation point on the end of Congress shall not. And it's a way of saying, hey, if we forgot anything, you can't do that either. And this is how they say it. The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. The 10th Amendment treats, this is not what we call in logic a hard disjunctive. This is a soft disjunctive. In other words, it's an or that means parentheses or this, or i.e. It doesn't mean like, do you want strawberry or chocolate? You can only have one now. That's not what that means. That means the people, or respectively to their representatives, the states. The states in this context are the embodiment of the people's rights. What do courts try to do after the 14th Amendment, which we'll get to, they try to separate those in addition to everything else. But this is that exclamation point that says, just in case we forgot anything, if it's not mentioned as a power granted to the federal government, that's not yours to do. That's illegal for you to be doing. That's actually an act of war to take that from the people. So, if the law is king, this is why, what's this got to do with, what's decentralization have to do with republicanism? Can't you just have, can't you mix and match? If the law is king over men, and if the man in office is only so by participation in that form of the office, then it follows that lesser magistrates are superior to more general magistrates naturally in their fountain power. And so a republican form of government has to maintain this federal system. Now that word comes from covenant theology, foetus, covenant, pact, or treaty. It's very Presbyterian. So is everything else in our constitutional system. But a republican form of government has to maintain the most central government in its ministerial form rather than its magisterial position. In other words, in its servant form instead of as a master over the states and people. This was the case in the United States until the events of 1861 to 1868-69. Two events in 1868 and 9. First, the ratification of the 14th Amendment, and secondly, a particular court case, Supreme Court case, Texas versus White. Let's first explain the 14th Amendment. Section 1 is the particularly relevant one, so I have it written there. It's a couple sections. And what it does, predictably to people at the time, was to turn the Constitution on its head. And the section reads, no state shall, first of all, hello, no state. Samuel, now they shall not listen to you, you shall listen to them. What happened? Now, no longer Congress shall not, Congress shall not, Congress shall not. Now, the federal government telling the people in the states, you shall not, you shall not, you shall not. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of... But that's a nice thing. Isn't it always? Isn't the candy that Fidel Castro handed to the little children when he told them to go to sleep and say, ask God for candy? Okay, kids, now lift up your heads, and there was no candy. Okay, now lower your heads and ask Fidel for candy. And he went around and put candy on all the desks and said, now open your eyes. You see, kids, Fidel can give you what God cannot. Oh, it's always nice. It's always sweet and nourishing and in the name of the children. Nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property. And they didn't even mean that, as we found out with Roe versus Wade and so on. Without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of laws. So, at least in the interpretation of this, and arguably its intent, it places the formerly sovereign states under the indivisible authorship of the central government. Never mind the first and more deadly clause now being trotted out to enshrine so-called birthright citizenship. And we'll come back to due process in just a second. But what matters at this point are the words, no state shall. No inferior shall. The other event the next year was the SCOTUS decision in Texas versus White, which ruled that the secession of the southern states was illegal, turning the concept of nullification on its head in the same general constitutional shift. So the idea that fountain power is represented by groups voluntarily compacting, saying, and it's right back to the Hobbes idea in the Leviathan. Once you give that up, you can't have it back. That was the decision. Really a nullification of natural law in addition to the Constitution itself. So our section in Lex Rex here is a lens through which to view our own government's subversion in a very brief time after its founding, when these concepts are neglected. So to cement the point home in one more way, Rutherford fields the objection of a guy named Barclayus. He says, it is absurd that the people should be both subject to the king and command the king also. That's an understandable objection at first glance. This is silly. How can you say the people are above the king? What's the point of having a king then? But Rutherford says it is not absurd that a father natural, as a private man, should be subject to his son, even that Jesse and his elder brother, the Lord of the rest, be subject to David their king. So just in different office. But if anybody should ask why centralization and decentralization matter to legitimate power, it's because they represent the two poles in the flow of power, central versus a local point. Think of water flowing to its lowest plane. And we don't think of power and the flow of power as a thing like we do in things in science. But this really calls attention to that. The very notion of restraining power in its intensity is inseparable from restraining it in terms of its direction and its scope. So let's look at this idea again of the king turning. Is that something we can actually see? And we should be able to say yes by now in everything we've seen in Junius and Rutherford. And let's begin with a conditional premise. If the power ordained of the magistracy is essential, and the specific man and his performance is accidental, remember that distinction. Essential, the thing itself, accidental, secondary things, which are not the thing itself. What follows? Well, since God ordained the former, the office, and not the latter in the same way. And this is the mistake, another mistake people make in Romans 13. God ordained that Nero would come to power. Yes, he did. And now we're talking about his decretive will. But Romans 13 is also talking about his design and his perceptive will. Okay, so Rutherford reasons, if this is true, that this office is conforming to an eternal law, and it's the job of that person to do so, he reasons we may resist the injustice of the king and not resist the king. And at first that seems, that's weird. But really what he means, and did I put it in brackets? I think I did, yeah. What he means by we may resist the injustice of the king and not resist the king. Well, if you're resisting the injustice of the king, aren't you resisting the king? You're just justified in doing it, but why is he saying it like that? The point is that the idea and the essence of the office is not the same thing as the man. And that's true of anything, a father. There's what a father should be, and then there are bad fathers. And if there's no such thing, a form, then what criteria would you say that a father is either better or worse? Same thing here. Put another way just below, if the office of a tyrant, so to speak, be contrary to a king's office, it is not from God, and so neither is the power from God. Yea, laws, when they begin to be hurtful, they leave. In other words, they cease in their matter. They leave off to be laws. And there he's almost quoting Thomas Aquinas, that a law, and we've talked about that before in Junius. Objection is obvious. And when I come back to this picture, which I will, notice the crown falling, and we'll have another picture where a guy's looking at that. Is that actually something we can see then? It seems so subjective. Okay. And that's the objection here. Who gets to say? It's the who gets to say objection. But who, says the royalist, shall be judge betwixt the king and the people, when the people allege that the king is a tyrant? Answer, there is a court of necessity, no less than a court of justice. And the fundamental laws must then speak. What does he mean, fundamental? Remember, natural more fundamental than civil. And the fundamental laws must then speak. And it is with the people in this extremity as if they had no ruler. So to this classic, who gets to decide? He's saying, you can tell. And I don't just mean that in some subjective way. There's actual principles here. Recall how Junius, in those early weeks, situated natural law between the human law below and the eternal law above. And what reason had to do with that? This is natural law reasoning. And here was the thing to look for, if you remember. It was that which was immutable and internal to the law. Sometimes people will call it the spirit of the laws. I know that phrase can be abused. But the idea would be the point of the law, the true point of it. Namely, to defend the image of God. If it's not doing that, if justice is perverted, then we've got to go back to basics. There's another way to say it. And that which was mutable and external to the laws were just circumstantial. Those things could change. And if you have to change one or the other, if people are dying every time you press this pomp and circumstance button, but we've always done it that way, and people are dropping dead, just stop pressing the button. But if I stop pressing that button, society will, you know what it needs to? It needs a reboot right now. It needs to go back to nature. And in fact, nature is already still there. So we can have all sorts of disagreements about the civil law. but a free people needs reason enough to discern the immutable form. And what's true of the law in Junius's book is true of this officer of that law in Rutherford's book. So he grants that natural law is not clear in the same way that Scripture is clear. But he says, and this is a good principle, tyranny is more visible and intelligible than heresy. Now, he doesn't say this, but let me just add something. Let me give you one reason why. I can't see your soul being plunged with a dagger from Satan's errors. I can see it with the mind's eye, but that takes a lot of training. I can see someone throwing a small child into a crocodile pit. I can see it as clear as day. And I can say, hey, that's not normal. Stop him. And it doesn't take any great act of parliament. And so he applies this to the test case of the rape of your country by Muslims and corresponding duty to punish the tyrants who let them in. This, he suggests, is clear as day by natural law reasoning. He says this: if a king bring in upon his native subjects 20,000 Turks armed, and the king lead them, it is evident they come not to make a friendly visit to salute the kingdom and depart in peace. The people have a natural throne of policy in their conscience to give warning and materially sentence against the king as a tyrant, and so by nature are to defend themselves. He's saying, when even your own government brings in thousands of Muslims and they're always doing nothing but killing and raping, I'm guessing that they're probably not having a celebration of Britain's anniversary or something, just in Middle Eastern garb. Well, how can you tell? Maybe statistics. So there's this that came out this week, which I'm sure the mainstream media worked hard to help everybody see and digest. Probably not. Now, is it why Starmer is resigning tomorrow? I don't know. I don't know if the British are quite up to stringing him up on a tree. I don't think they have that in them right now. But when you have 250,000 of your girls raped, and in case after case after case, it's documented by the physicians even tossing them back and sometimes laughing at them as they bring them back to their rapists. Quote, have at him again, end quote. And sometimes, I don't remember the exact Muslim phrase, it's ritualistic in some cases. So in other words, the same kind of things that you saw in the Epstein emails, you see here documented. And they're doing their best to make sure nobody sees that, which is why I'm making you see it. Rutherford says that's obvious. Is it? I agree with him. But I want to spread that to others and say, is that obvious to you? It should be. The point that tyranny is accidental to the office is displayed not just about the monarchical form. Rutherford returns to the Scriptures, to the idea of their aristocracy, their officers, to make the same point. He shows it from the flow from Judges to Samuel and says, for there were no kings in Israel in the Judges' day, the government not being changed till near the end of Samuel's government. That aristocracy was now weakened, in other words, by the time you get to 1 Samuel 8, weakened, I believe not. In other words, the form. He doesn't doubt that Samuel's sons were corrupt, but the form was not weakened. God's design had not failed. Seeing God so highly commendeth it, and calleth it his own, reigning over his people. So bear that in mind about 1 Samuel 8. They're not rejecting you, they're rejecting me from being king over them. So it's something about that form, he's putting his own authority on that. It's not like that had less authority than the monarchy. Okay? So Rutherford continues, the weakening of it through abuse is not to a purpose more than the abuse of monarchy. So he shows a couple of things by that. Again, in Britain, it would have been the estates And there were other Reformed authors, I'll skip that section, that talk about this. We could have done this class on any number of several dozen authors that draw this out. In question 16, that can't be right. 26. That was a typo. I'm glad I got it right there. He uses Pharaoh and Israel as an example. He says the prelate must prove, now his argument's right, that God gave a royal and kingly power to King Pharaoh, due to him by virtue of his kingly calling, to kill all the male children of Israel, to make slaves of themselves, and compel them to work in brick and clay while their lives were a burden to them, and he goes right from the Bible to his own day, so it's not just annoying people like Matt Marino that does that. Rutherford did it in his day. I'm sure people in his pews were like, yeah, but come on, I thought we were talking about the Bible. That if a Roman Catholic, Mary of England, for example, should kill all the male children of Protestants by the hands of papists at the Queen's commandment and make bond slaves of all the peers, judges, and 3 estates, who made her a free princess? Yet notwithstanding that Mary had sworn to maintain the Protestant religion, they were to suffer and not to defend themselves. So according to your argument, they were just to suffer and not defend themselves. He must prove, the royalist must prove, that Israel was to give their male children to Pharaoh's butchers, for to hide them was to resist a royal power. So you see what he's doing? He's building up to the right of the people and through the agency of the lesser of the estates to defend themselves. Last point, got to get into this. I call it the state of war consciousness or state of war recognition. In this, by the way, you see this solid line is the new setup. It was that human law was permeable, thus the dotted line. Remember, it was in color brown versus the green. Where's the green? Where's nature? It's gone. We've neglected it. So now, in its place, this is ultimate. Whoever is in charge now. So previously, human law was within natural law. Now, human law is now entirely positive. In other words, it is by will, and that becomes a system that is gamed. What do I mean by a gamed system? Well, let's look at it a little bit. He borrows from a couple of authors who raise a pragmatic objection that he uses to his advantage, that the king must sometimes seize power precisely to save the rule of law long term. And often people hear that being said and they'll say, oh, right, yeah, like during wartime. Like Churchill during World War II clamped down on certain rights. And even you'll see Roosevelt, whoever, seized certain sectors of the industry for the wartime effort. Yeah, sure. That doesn't make them a tyrant. That just special circumstances. Yes, that is correct. But we're slower sometimes to tell the time for war. The ability to tell war from peace, just like other elements of natural law reasoning, is something that I call state of war consciousness or state of war recognition. And in terms of Genesis 1 to Genesis 9, that kind of terminology, what we've already seen, a state of war exists when a collective force, so it's not some mystical thing. What do you mean by when is a state of war? Okay, think of Genesis 1 and 9 and that guy with the shovel and so on. A state of war exists when there is a collective force, whether it's embodied by some foreign army invading or by some significant force from within one's borders. Let me stop. That's crazy. That's archaic. No. Why does the president, and this is on Jefferson's memorial, I swear, no, this is just on Jefferson's. They say it differently in the oath of office. But they take an oath to defend this Constitution against all enemies, what? Foreign and domestic. Both. That's so archaic. No, it's not. Why would you think that? You can just go loon, even in your own house. You can wipe out a lot of people. So whether foreign or domestic, the sword meant by Romans 13, the decisive population endangering violence, has been turned inward against the image of God, against one's own citizens. True power has been turned on its head. That's all I mean by state of war. And state of war recognition is seeing that happening and saying, oh, it's time. That's happening. It's actually not mystical or crazy or archaic or anything like that. It's not violent to recognize it. It is the violence I am recognizing. By bringing it up, I may make you feel like you've been violated. I suggest we need to get over that, and that's part of the problem with the whole 20th century mindset. Rutherford says of such a seizure of power, this he may, yes, he may seize that power, in the case when sudden foreign invasion threateneth ruin, inevitably to king and kingdom, a physician may rather cut a gangrened member than suffer the whole body to perish. Gangrened member, that's so dehumanizing. Aren't we all made in the image of God? Yes, but you are conflating things. Maybe honestly, but I have my doubts. He says, number one, this is not an arbitrary power, but naturally tied and fettered to the same supreme law for the safety of the people. That the king break through not the law, but the letter of the law. Oh, no. That is a distinction we've been working with. That he break through not the law, but so he has to break through the letter of the law, yes, a lower law, to seize again and uphold a higher law for the safety of the people. And I had to look this up. This is an archaic spelling of surgeon. I was like, what is that word? And I thought because of the analogy he was working with, but sure enough, yeah, surgeon. Not by any prerogative that he hath above the art of surgery, but by necessity cutteth off a gangrened member. Thus it is not arbitrary. In other words, so gaming the system is a foot in the body, think of it as being possessed by a demon, except instead of a sector of your society being members of your society, some enemy, foreign or domestic, they could be foreign, and they get domestic by invading the host and playing the role of the foot. Thus it is not arbitrary to the king to save his people from ruin, but by the strong and imperious law of the people's safety he doth it. For if he did not, he were a murderer of his people. No, he would join in with the mob. So here's a picture of it. Now don't worry about that yet. That's going to be coming out of this. This is one of the false ways that distract us. And I'll use as my example some of the language in the 14th Amendment. But they use the expression today of crossing the Rubicon, obviously an allusion to Julius Caesar, et cetera, people use it too metaphorically. If you're actually going to, and what Rutherford's talking about here is a real crossing of the Rubicon, still metaphorical because we're not in Italy, but you get the idea, crossing the Potomac, whatever. But you see what he's saying here. The system has been gamed, but everything they're going to do is completely constitutional. The Constitution will not come and save you. It will not fly to your defense like a magic carpet, because it will read exactly as the foot needs it to read, just like the hand. Due process. Any person, they're a person, therefore due process shall not be denied. Everything they do, there are steps they'll call, no, we'll ban Sharia law. They will laugh at you, they're already laughing. You can't ban Sharia law. One of the things it commands is for them to lie while they take over, switch the words around, as Marxists have been doing for 100 years, like, why haven't you learned this lesson yet? You don't think Muslims will do the same? And then finally you'll wake up, but now we can stop it because now it's actual murder, and murder is illegal. Good luck, you waited too long. And so what Rutherford is saying, and he uses an example from his day, is that you'll sometimes hear this attributed to Napoleon, he who saves his country breaks no law. And I think people that utter that do it as mindlessly as people that talk about crossing the Rubicon, but that would be the idea. But he says, the circumstances are unique that he uses in the invasion of his island, of Scotland, that section of it. But nevertheless, he continues that good laws are not contrary to one another. Well, what does he mean by that? Does he mean any of these? Well, that's true if they're good laws. But what have we already learned? That if this was right, wise, these would be in conformity to eternal law through natural law. And so what he means by those laws are not the sense of it, if you want to make the 14th Amendment read in a good way, birthright citizenship. That was intended for freed slaves. That was not intended for fighter pilots to airdrop a baby and then say, boom, Sharia law. That was not the intent of it. But if you do that, in principle, there's no reason why all 8 billion people on this globe are not American citizens. And so it's rightly understood that interpreting that way will end national sovereignty, which is the point. So the good in the human laws that call for universal application and the good in the natural law that call for a state of war suspension, Rutherford's saying those are consistent with each other. This reading is not consistent with God's law. So that, think of, again, this Rubicon. Now it's a wall, a fortress. If he's going to cross it, he has to go through. He has to look mean. He has to risk being called bad names. You're so mean. He's going to break through that layer. When he breaketh through the letter of the law, yet he breaketh not the law. For if 20,000 rebels invade Scotland, he is to command all to rise. Though the formality of a parliament cannot be had to indict the war, as our law provideth. That the king command this, as king, is not a particular of positive law, but he doth it as the man and as a member of the kingdom. So in other words, he's stripping it down to natural law level. In other words, there is no legitimate government now in this case. He is not anti-government. He is reconstituting government where there is none right now. That's what the lesser magistrate's doing. Or he used the example of the king, if the king does it. Sure. The law of nature, which knoweth no dream of such a prerogative, forceth him to it, as every member is by nature's indictment to care for the whole. Laws are not laws if they be made, if they be not made for the safety of the people. So, answering the objection of the risk of sedition, but then one of the mean names they'll call you is seditious. You're being seditious. Haven't you read Romans 13? Sedition. He responds, tyranny is a more dangerous sin than sedition. How so? By how much more the lives of many and true religion are to be preferred to the safety of one and a false peace. So I could stop there. I do have, and I really do, I just have concluding thoughts on chapter 27 that are not as important. I'm going to try to wrap up the book next week to get to the specifics of what he says about the lesser magistrate. So that'll be next week. Let me just open it up to questions or comments before Joe gets here.
How would you say, because it just seems like history repeats itself, like this is just written, seems like it was written this year, just specifically applied to just us, but this was happening hundreds of years ago. How do we get outside of history repeating itself?
In one sense, by getting outside of history, which you can't do, but the whole natural law and all that stuff, one of the reasons we read older books, actually, in any situation, is to not to get out of our time and place. We're always creatures of our time and place, but to behold that thing that must be true and unchangeable over everything. Because if you don't, then the slightest little winds, the slightest little pressure to just stop it, just go with the flow, will seem impressive to you. But when you step outside of that, so the first thing is learn it and be solid and know what is true and real and just. And then secondly, the application stages, as you continue to read these things, to ask how they apply then versus now. There are circumstantial differences, and to know what those are. And that's kind of part of what Junius was training us to do too, the difference between what is immutable versus what has to change in different circumstances. Obviously, we have a different form of government than they do in a lot of respects. But that's a very generic answer. But Sean?
What do you view as more evil? The King of England taking control of the church within England, or the American colonists revolting against the king?
Well, that second one I like. That's what's more evil?
Yeah.
Well, the first. One, because it's directly contrary to God's law. And of course it depends what somebody means by taking control of the English church. Now, my Anglican friends will get mad at me here, but Your church was started by a woman. She was the head of the church in the Act of Supremacy in 1558. Yes, Elizabeth. No, it was Henry because he wanted to have many wives. Okay, still over a woman. Different, but I'm not kidding about the first. Now you say that's neither here nor there because we would recognize the magistrate can do certain things toward religion. So that gets into things that are hotly debated now about what the magistrate, man or woman, has authority to do in relation to the church. But if by control you mean seizing things that belong uniquely to the ministry, the whole keys of the kingdom versus the sword, those are things the Bible directly lays out. There's certain things the king or any government may not do that are clearly evil, to oppress the church or even to try to do things that are not secular government's business to do. Whereas the revolt of the colonies was a defensive measure. And like any just war, unjust things happen in just wars. If everything had to be just for a war to be just, then no war fought by mortals would have ever been just. So I just add that to that and say that that was justified. Any other questions? Any buzzer beaters? I don't see Joe, so it's like we're getting extra Q&A time. Yes?
You talked about the division of laws between federal and state governments, talking in our framework and the U.S. framework. What happens when our elected representatives delegate their powers to agencies, to bureaus, to bureaucrats?
Yeah.
And then the laws multiply more than Congress could ever make by their own means.
Yeah.
So that you've got so many laws that you can hardly ever fail from being a lawbreaker.
Right. It's harder to make the case, although you still can and should, that these agencies are not, A, they're not electable, B, they're not powers that were granted to the federal government, because there's clauses in the executive and legislative sections that somebody could say, that right there, that allows me to delegate this, call it bureaucracy if you want. That's a harder case to make. It becomes easier when you show that the things they're doing are not powers. For example, education. There's nothing in the Constitution that even hints that the federal government has the power, but they're giving you 7%, 7% of your taxes, whatever. So that's called a bribe. Anyway, so the easier argument to make, in my opinion, is, are they doing things that the people in the states have not allowed the federal government to have?
And I'm sure there's money laundering behind a lot of that.
Yeah.
But you're not seeing, you won't see it.
That would be so rare of them, though. No. Sean.
Can I ask you, totally unrelated, but something that is like in the news?
Sure.
In the Southern Baptist Convention right now is in the process of debating whether or not women should be in professional ministry. I know what our position is, but one of the greatest broader arguments is coming from the Church of England, where they have feel as though that they have settled this argument, and they should be the standard bearer for the global Protestant communion that the church has allowed women in professional ministry for hundreds of years.
Yeah.
And there's a guy, I can't remember his name, he's an older gentleman who's kind of a well-known, in the evangelical circles, popular amongst reformists, but he's kind of divergent in this area. I'm trying to remember his name. CE or TE or, anyways.
Well, there's a lot of egalitarians out there, and I would say a twofold argument. One, from Scripture, we would just argue that that's not what Paul taught. He taught the opposite. Secondly, I would say this is a classic case of judging something by its fruits. You can make a pragmatic argument, and you can make it within the Anglican Church itself. Look at the Anglican Church in the UK that celebrates this. How's that working out for them? Look at the Anglican offshoot of Anglicanism in Africa and ask yourself, do they have female bishops. And does their doctrine and practice tend to be more conservative? Yes, by light years. Is there a connection? I think there is. So that's not, I don't want to say that. I don't want to say that against the guys of England. I'm sure there's good guys in the Church of England that are trying to, and they're in the minority. So, yeah. All right. Well, let me end there. Let me pray. Father, we thank you for this day, and we give you praise and pray that you would help us today in all we do to magnify your name. I pray that you would bless and edify all the saints as we worship together.